Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted that an old friend of Global Order, Commodore Anil Jai Singh, has joined us today, a veteran submariner, commentator on naval issues. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sengupta. It's always a pleasure to be on your program. Thank you.
I want to thank you, sir. I want to begin straight away by asking you, as days and weeks and months go by, a little bit of a trickle of information about the famous Project Varsha, India's efforts, the Indian Navy's efforts to build submarine facilities, docking facilities in the Bay of Bengal waters, essentially to dock our SSBNs, which are nuclear ballistic missile tipped, submarines. We are getting more and more information about this project. Now, of course, a lot of this project is indeed extremely classified. So I want to divert your comments towards one particular area. Why are we building this? And what is this meant to counter? Can we begin there?
Okay, as you mentioned, Varsha is a very classified program, so not very much is known about it in the open domain. I've just been reading a few articles recently in the media, which have mentioned Varsha as a new submarine base being built on India's east coast, basically to house the SSBNs that India is now operating. As you're aware, SSBNs are very specialized platforms. They're very complex platforms. They have a different role. They have a strategic role, not necessarily a normal operational warfighting role. They need to be protected because of the kind of capability they carry. And they will always, be sort of in the eyes of the adversary as a capability that needs to be neutralized or checked, because what it provides the country is a very credible second strike capability. And SSBN is more or less an invulnerable second strike capability, and really makes and really completes the nuclear triad. Therefore, any such base that comes up will firstly be a very protected base. A lot of research must have gone into where exactly should it be located. It will perhaps house the SSBNs. And SSBNs, as I mentioned, by virtue of their complexity, will require very specialized maintenance facilities, support facilities, an infrastructure that is different from a regular infrastructure that the Navy has. And therefore, they should be away from the regular, platforms, other naval platforms which are close to the shore and close to urban centers. So all these factors must have determined where these SSBNs need to be based. India is only the sixth country in the world which operates SSBNs, the others being the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. That's Russia, China, England, France, and the US. And if you see their basing facilities, their SSBNs are also based in very specialized facilities. For example, the Chinese have a very specialized facility in Hainan, where they have submarine pens. The submarine pens, these bases are located in deep water, so that the submarine can firstly be docked in a pen which is protected, and secondly, they don't have to transit on surface for very long before they can dive. So they have to be in the proximity of deep waters. So factors such as these determine where the SSBNs are going to be based. So I'm sure if Varsha is being built to house the SSBNs as is reported, then a lot of thought must have gone into it, and that would be the reason for a separate base being built, especially for these submarines.
Talk to me a little bit about the role of such a base especially in the Bay of Bengal waters, because this is a zone that is becoming more and more contested with each passing year. Of course, the Bangladesh story is well known to everyone. There's a Pakistani angle to this, and of course the big angle is of China. And there's been a lot of conversation. You and I have had conversations on this platform, on Global Order, about Chinese influence in these waters. Talk to us a little bit about how that part of the story is developing according to you.
So, the Bay of Bengal is firstly, it has a couple of advantages. It is it's a very fairly protected body of water, because we've got the Andaman Nicobar Islands in its southern extremities, which narrow the access to the Bay of Bengal and can be closely monitored by India. The ingress and out and entry and exit of ships and submarines from there. That's number one. Number two, so far it was quite an Indian lake. There was never really any opposition to the Indian Navy operating in the Bay of Bengal, unlike the Arabian Sea, where we always had the Pakistan Navy as an irritant, over the years. And it still is. But what has changed in the last few years is that China has started making major inroads into the Bay of Bengal. we always knew that they were supporting Myanmar with a lot of military hardware. They've now given a submarine to Myanmar. Myanmar operates a Ming class submarine. They've given 2 submarines to Bangladesh in 2017 and 19. Again,
Which
2
are
Ming
also,
class
I believe,
submarines.
yeah, Ming class submarines. That's right, yes.
Yeah. So it's not the submarines per se that are really the threat, because Ming class submarines are 30, 35, 40 years old. So they're not really the most ideal, and contemporary combat platforms. But what it provides China is a submarine facility where their own submarines can come and dock if required. Because now that these submarines are operating, a basic fundamental submarine infrastructure capability has to be created, which China has created because they've given these submarines. And that could well be used by the Chinese as and when they start deploying submarines in the Bay of Bengal. Now, what is worrying is that in Bangladesh, they have built a submarine base called BNS Sheikh Hasina, which was commissioned in March 2023 by Sheikh Hasina, then Prime Minister of Bangladesh. So even when they had this, when Bangladesh and India were on much better terms with each other, these facilities are still coming up. Now that there is a little bit of friction, this is a greater cause for concern, because China is very quick to step into a power vacuum when it sees one, and promptly lands up with a lot of economic largesse, military diplomacy, military hardware, etc. So we will have to watch closely what China intends to do. But what it definitely will intend to do, in my understanding, is that it will start deploying submarines in the Bay of Bengal, which was a limitation it had earlier. Even though China has periodically sent submarines to the Indian Ocean, one of its greatest constraints, it has 2 major constraints in deploying submarines in the Indian Ocean. Firstly, the access to the Indian Ocean is through the Malacca Straits, the Lombok Straits, and the Sunda Straits, all of which are not suitable for submarines to transit dived. They have to transit on the surface, which means that when they enter the Indian Ocean, they're visible to everybody. And so some amount of monitoring of their movement can be done after that, because now that there's a Chinese submarine in the Indian Ocean. And similarly, when they leave the Indian Ocean, they have to leave on surface. So they can be monitored. The only deep water entry into the Indian Ocean is from another strait called the Ambarbatai. But that is further south. So that increases the distance the submarines have to travel from China to the Indian Ocean. Now, Chennai, if we were to take Chennai as the Indian, let's say, coastal edge, then these submarines would have to transit almost 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers just to reach the Bay of Bengal, which means that it places a lot of constraints. It may not place too many constraints on an SSN, a nuclear submarine, but it certainly places constraints on conventional submarines. However, if there was a base available to the Chinese where these submarines could enter harbor, dock, and carry out basic support maintenance, replenishment of its supplies, etc., then it's good to go again for a deployment. And therefore, it can operate in the Indian Ocean, in the Bay of Bengal, quite like an Indian submarine would operate in the Bay of Bengal, with similar endurance, similar capability, similar everything. So that is something that causes me concern, because SSBNs are traditionally always tracked by either SSNs or conventional submarines. Because, they can lurk around over there. Now, however secret the base might be, everyone will know the general location of that base. So you can always have a deployment of an SSK, off and on over there when they suspect that there's some Indian movement going to happen, which can then track or monitor the movement of the SSBN, which obviously we would not want to do. Now, SSBNs also operate differently. So there are various concepts of SSBN deployment. One is called a bastion concept. A bastion concept is where the SSBN doesn't travel very far away from its own waters and is able to deploy in the relative safety of its own waters or in the vicinity of its own waters, but has the ordnance or the weapon capability to be able to launch its strike wherever the requirement may be. For example, the missiles carried by the American SSBNs, the Russian SSBNs, even the Chinese SSBNs, all operate in the region of 8,000 kilometers and more, range of 8,000 kilometers. So the submarine really doesn't have to go in harm's way. It can be closer to home waters, but still be able to target whatever needs to be targeted, or whatever the government orders it to target. So that is something we also perhaps would develop. At the moment, we probably don't have those kind of missile ranges. We have 2 missiles right now. One is a 750 kilometer Sagarika missile, which was more of a technology demonstrator. That obviously, well, it can do the job, but it's not the ideal weapon in terms of the range it has. But the K4 is being developed also, which is a 3,500 kilometer missile, which was recently fired by Arigat, which was in the news. It was in the newspapers as well. Successfully fired by Arigat, which is the second Indian SSBN. So that definitely adds to our SSBN capability. But ideally, I'm sure we would also like to have a missile in the 6 to 7,000 kilometer range, so that then we can keep our SSB in relative safety and still be able to deliver whatever needs to be ordnance needs to be delivered wherever or wherever we think we need to deliver our ordnance. So that is the concept. So as far as the Chinese are concerned, they would definitely like to keep a watch on our SSB and deployments. And if they are able to access the Bay of Bengal, which it seems they will be able to if they have bases like Sheikh Hasina and they have submarine support facilities in Myanmar, then this is something we need to be concerned about.
My other question then is that what kind of facility is Myanmar still likely to be able to offer the Chinese? Because the ongoing civil war seems to have really dampened a lot of their, or at least put question marks on a lot of what they could really support the Chinese with. Quite like in Bangladesh, the ouster of Sheikh Hasina and what's going on, the turmoil that's going on, because that's not ended. The interim government is only that, it's interim. So, how much support does Bangladesh and Bangladesh and Myanmar really be able to give China, in your opinion?
No, I think, I know there's a lot of unrest happening in Myanmar, but the junta is very much there. And insofar as military capability goes, I don't think that is really being affected by all this unrest which is there. It's more, and not so much in the maritime domain, if you really look at it. There's not much happening in the maritime domain. So the very fact that the Chinese are, or rather the Myanmaris are operating a Ming-class submarines means China would have created some sort of capability to support this submarine there. By the way, India has also given a submarine to Myanmar. I don't know if you're aware of it, a kilo-class submarine on lease to Myanmar.
Yeah.
So we too try to counter the Chinese initiatives, and which is a good thing, of course. And it's a very, very advanced form of defense diplomacy. Giving a submarine is a very high-end form of defense diplomacy, if you ask me. So we've also attempted to sort of blunt the Chinese edge in Myanmar. But with the junta and of course, this was given before the junta came to power. But now I think India is also engaging a little bit with the junta, at least as far as these things are concerned. So yes, it may not be the ideal situation right now for China. They would definitely like to make greater inroads into Myanmar, have a more stable footing over there. But notwithstanding that, the very fact that they have something is a matter of concern. Similarly, in Bangladesh, I mean, while there is a lot of uncertainty, political uncertainty in the country, but I think the Chinese would be looking to take advantage of that, rather than let it disadvantage their efforts over there. And Mohammad Yunus has been to China and he's made a few statements which have not really gone down well with the Indian establishment. So of course China would be trying to woo the new dispensation there, whatever finally comes to power. And one of the things they use very effectively is their defense diplomacy. Hardware of military hardware export, because they have this second rung of equipment which is available for export. For example, the Ming-class submarines. Ming-class submarines are no longer of any use to China. So they're good export platforms. Refurbish them, modernize them a little bit, and just pass it on at friendship prices to whosoever you want to do. It used to be exactly how the Soviet Union used to do it in the 70s and 80s. They used to call it a friendship price and give it for next to nothing to the allies they were trying to cultivate at that time. The Chinese would be doing something similar. Of course, one of the limitations China has, and this seems to be coming to light now, I don't know, it's again what's reported in the media, is that while China has the numbers, they may not have the quality that is required. And this came to light also when now China was trying to give 3 submarines to Thailand as well. But the 3 modern submarines, the Type 039s, with the AIP capability, etc. But China had committed to giving these submarines with German engines. Now, Europe has put an embargo on all defense exports to China. So obviously these engines are no longer fetching up in China. And so China then offered Chinese engines with these submarines, which Thailand refused. So Thailand has cancelled that contract because it did not want the Chinese engines. And again, one doesn't know for a fact, but one reads here and there that even the Pakistan Navy, which operates Chinese submarines, was going to operate the Hangor class, is not too pleased about the fact that it's going to do so with Chinese engines. But that again is something that's in the media. It's speculative. I'm sure China, with all this technological capability, would be trying to mitigate these weaknesses or vulnerabilities that it has in its military hardware. So it's not something we should take lightly. We should never underestimate China, or allow ourselves to be lulled into a false sense of complacency that the equipment is not good and so they're not a match for us. I think we should give them the respect they deserve. and be prepared for whatever they can pit against us in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, particularly in the underwater domain.
I wanted to ask you, the fact that India decided to build such a facility in the Bay of Bengal rather than the Arabian Sea, strategically, what does that suggest to you?
I think two things. Firstly, as I mentioned in the beginning, the waters in the Bay of Bengal are deeper. If you look at the North Arabian Sea, the continental shelf is far shallower. The gradient is far less than it is on the east coast. For example, the 100-meter line, let's say the 100-meter depth line on the west coast, is at a considerable distance from the shore. Whereas on the east coast, it is much closer to the shore. I mean, within, I think about, I can't comment on the exact distance, but within less than 50 miles, one could be in more than 100 meters of water. And the 50-meter line is even at a lesser distance from the shore. So that is one major factor, because there's no point having a SSBN capability if your SSBN has to travel first on surface for a few hours before it can dive. That will give away the position of your SSBN, it'll give away the deployment of your SSBN, it'll give away everything that you're trying to sort of keep secret. So I think the number one criteria must have been depths of water. That's very important. Secondly, what is our threat perception from a nuclear perspective? Or what sort of capability are we looking at? What are the kind of targeting we would need to do? Who are the main adversaries we would like to target? So if you look at all these things, perhaps the East Coast offered a better, the Eastern Seaboard was perhaps better suited for SSBN deployment or SSBN basing than the West Coast. And there must have been a lot of other strategic considerations, I'm sure. I'm not really commenting on them because I'm not party to any of these. And secondly, I don't think I'm qualified enough to speak about what are the other strategic considerations. But to me, prima facie, it's the depths and the location of both the Eastern Seaboard and the Western Seaboard must have been the primary factors.
And I also wanted to ask you this question, is that there have been some speculation in the past about where Pakistan keeps its own second strike capabilities and in which waters, in what way, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the Arabian Sea is a question. But as you say, perhaps there are other considerations, and certainly the China factor that may have contributed. I want to delve a little deeper into the other point that you made, sir, on China's defense diplomacy, especially in the maritime domain. Talk to me a little bit about, because Chinese technology, I totally agree with you that the days of thinking that, Chinese material goods are inferior technology and so on and so forth, that age has probably come to an end. We are seeing even in civilian technology like cars and so on and so forth, that Chinese technology is really superseding, perhaps in some cases, even American technology. So therefore, perhaps we shouldn't take that for granted. Talk to me a little bit about how you see Chinese defense diplomacy as far as giving material goods is concerned is expanding, and what India could perhaps do to counter this, because we perhaps don't have the kind of resources in sheer volume terms to be handing goods like this.
You're absolutely right. China is very aggressive with its defense diplomacy. It is willing to export defense equipment to many countries, the countries it needs to cultivate or to bring into its own sphere of influence. We've all heard of, the string of pearls. If you really look at it, starting from the Chinese mainland, almost every country now, even the naval base in Cambodia apparently is ready. So every country starting from the Chinese mainland and going across whether east of Malacca Straits or west of Malacca Straits, all the way right up to the Western Indian Ocean, there is a Chinese presence in almost every country of one kind or another. They may not be naval bases. If they're not naval bases, there are naval ports. Or rather, not naval ports, but there are ports where China has control. That's one. Secondly, it is, Chinese have positioned their specialists in many countries. They send people they sort of train a lot of navies. Their submarines they've given to, as I mentioned, they've given to Bangladesh, they're building in Pakistan, they've given to Myanmar, they want to give to Thailand. They're trying to woo other Southeast Asian countries to take their submarines. If you look at on the west coast, of course, there isn't so much on the Western Seaboard at the moment in terms of Chinese military hardware, except maybe, I'm not sure whether Maldives will get anything in the future. Of course, nothing has potent as submarines, but certainly they could get patrol boats, or Sri Lanka could get a frigate, or countries like that. So anything is worthwhile, or even radars or sonars or any kind of equipment, or some guns for their ships. All of this gives you some sort of leverage in a country. That is in terms of only military hardware export. Then, of course, comes the more subtle forms of defense diplomacy, exercising with each other. They keep their ships coming into the Indian Ocean and visiting other countries. They have a hospital ship which goes on goodwill missions around the region for not only on HADR missions. HADR is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, but otherwise. So you go there, go to another country, you set up a medical camp over there because you have a hospital ship. This is all soft military diplomacy, but all very effective military diplomacy. Plus, of course, China has the money. So they can afford to pump in money and create capability and infrastructure in various countries. But this is not to suggest that this approach is really giving them a great advantage over India, because I think India understands its own resource limitations and adapts different means of building capacity. And if you really look at it in the Indian Ocean, I think we're doing rather well. We've Maldives and Sri Lanka are looking at us as their first line, their first responder. We are looked at first responders. We are the preferred security partner in the Indian Ocean. We are all for a secure, rules-based order at sea. All of that matters to countries, because today maritime security underpins every activity in the oceans, be it trade, be it the movement of hydrocarbons, be it even things like fishing, anything. Everything is underpinned by maritime security, because the maritime threat has undergone a very subtle shift from the traditional threat of state-on-state conflicts to more non-traditional threats like IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, piracy, maritime terrorism. We've seen what's happening in the Red Sea and how India controlled and in fact almost neutralized all the piracy. The Somali pirates had again reared their head in the Western Indian Ocean. We managed to neutralize that. At one stage, 12 Indian warships were deployed there. These are not things which are aimed at any particular country, but they're aimed at disturbing the maritime equilibrium, so to speak, and that no country can afford today, because trade dependencies, transcend continents. The very fact that ships have had to divert shipping companies have had to divert their ships around the Cape of Good Hope in itself is causing a lot of grief to the global south, because of the higher prices, the longer times it's taking for cargo to reach. It's hurting exports, it's hurting imports. It's making a lot of difference. So maritime security, I think India's approach to maritime security in the region through capacity. Firstly, we have inclusive capacity building. We don't sort of push ourselves, shove ourselves down people's throats like the Chinese do with their wolf warrior diplomacy. Very aggressive, very sort of belligerent. We are not like that. We are more inclusive. We are cooperative. We are collaborative. We pay attention to what these countries have to say. We understand their concerns. We are sensitive to their concerns. You've seen how successful the recent visit to Mauritius was. Both Sri Lanka and Maldives have sort of, our foreign minister was in both places before the presidents came to power. So I think we handle it in a different manner, but we're equally effective. However, China is not going to let up. China's ultimately strategic aim being 2049, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese people, which is other alternates speak for, we want to be the world's number one superpower. So China is not going to let up easily. It's going to focus a lot of its capacity on achieving this aim once it is decided it's going to do it. A lot of President Xi Jinping's internal prestige and external prestige is riding on this. So it's not something he's going to allow it to sort of go on the back burner. There will be reverses. I mean, we've seen the setback happening into the Belt and Road Initiative, but these are, I think, blips in the larger picture. I don't think we should set too much in store by the fact that the BRI is an economic flop. It was never meant to. Making it an economic success was of course the intention, but more important was the strategic intent that drove the BRI. And in that, China has been fairly successful. They've got a presence in many countries in the Indian Ocean region, and right up to Europe. Of course, if you look at our India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, that's supposed to be an alternate to the BRI. We are doing a lot of work in Africa. At one time, if you remember, with Japan, we had worked on the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which was supposed to be an alternative again to the Chinese economic assistance that was being given in a more inclusive manner. Of course, it wasn't very successful, but there are various other initiatives that are happening all the time. And countries in Africa are now coming more and more in the limelight in the larger strategic discourse of the Indo-Pacific. Earlier, we didn't really pay much attention to the east coast of Africa, but that's becoming more and more important now. So I think overall, India is also very effective in its diplomacy by other means. But yes, China would definitely takes a lot of advantage of its military hardware that it has and its military power to, create a favorable maritime environment for itself in the region.
I have one last question for you in this session, sir, if I may, which is to do with building military bases. Now, the US was one power which is particularly successful in building numerous military bases around the world. Even the recent sort of conversation about Diego Garcia, for instance, there was all this conversation, but it was always very clear that the US would never give up a key base that they had. And indeed, they haven't given it up. In fact, even better, they're making the UK pay for it for the next 99 years. Now, the Chinese are also beginning to counter this by trying to build bases of their own. You mentioned a couple of these in your last answer. India doesn't seem to be that successful in building bases. Talk to me a little bit about how that contestation with China could unfold.
So China has a global intent. It is not looking at only its own waters. I mean, Taiwan and South China Sea a red line. It's not going to let anyone cross. These are its core interests. But these are not the ultimate strategic objectives. The strategic objective, as I mentioned, is 2049, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese people, and avenging the century of humiliation and all the other terminology that's been used to describe it. So China is not going to let that let these other irritants sidetrack that ultimate goal of its. So, and if it has to do so, China has followed the long history has proven that the rise and fall of great powers has generally happened in the maritime domain. Whether you look at the European domination of the world, you look at the British domination of the world, and since World War II, how the Americans have dominated the geopolitical space. And now China is intending to do the same, also using maritime power. A country which barely had a navy in 1979, it had just a few ships, incapable of even defending its first island chain, is today the world's largest navy. It's not only the world's largest navy, it's the world's largest merchant fleet, it's the world's largest fishing fleet, it's the world's largest shipbuilder, it's got the world's largest coast guard. In every parameter of maritime power, military and non-military, China is the world's leader today in less than 50 years. Now, that's a remarkable achievement by any standards. And obviously, it lends itself to a larger strategic goal of global domination. And the classic Mahanian approach of Alfred Thayer Mahan. And therefore, China is not going to let up. Now, my take is that, in 2015, China established theater commands. It restructured its own military within and established theater commands. Now, while at the moment the theater commands are all located on the Chinese mainland and are focusing on different regions of China, the Western Command, the Eastern Command, the Southeastern Command, etc., I think ultimately when China is confident enough and has the kind of resources, it will move its theater commands to wherever it thinks it needs its bases to be. Now, for example, if you take Djibouti, now they've set up an overseas base at Djibouti. It's manned by the Chinese military. Of course, there are people who say that, well, as a base, it's not really going to help China very much at this point in time. But eventually, China will create the capability there if it thinks Djibouti is going to be important, and it is, because it gives China access right up to the Horn of Africa, the westernmost extremity of the Indian Ocean. It will definitely position its ships there. Media reports have indicated that they've extended the jetty over there to be able to accommodate an aircraft carrier in the future. Now, China is building a huge blue water navy. That navy is going to definitely come and operate in the Indian Ocean, because the Indian Ocean, it's important for China to be a major presence in the Indian Ocean for two reasons. Firstly, in its own waters, maritime geography does not favor it, because it's got too many of these little islands and little smaller countries, narrow waters, straits, etc., to be able to project power the way a superpower would like to project power. If it has to project power in that manner, like the Americans project power, it would need the sea space to do it. The Indian Ocean provides that sea space. So it will definitely like to be a very major presence in the Indian Ocean eventually. Maybe by the end of this decade, maybe by 2035 or whatever timeline it decides for itself. And based on how soon and how intense can its naval expansion continue to be, whether they can sustain that sort of momentum in their naval expansion. And secondly, I think more important than Indian Ocean providing the sea space, it is the Indian Ocean which gives China access to the Atlantic. And if it has to be any power of reckoning globally, it has to be able to establish its presence in the Atlantic as well. So if it has to get to the Atlantic, it has to go through the Indian Ocean. If it has to go through the Indian Ocean, it has to access it through the western exits of the Indian Ocean. Therefore, it definitely needs a naval presence there to protect its trade, to protect its shipping, to protect its maritime interests in that region. And therefore, I feel that the Djibouti base will become far more important in the years to come. Now, China has a lot of ports. Ports are not bases, because bases, like people say, if you have a base, you should have the wherewithal to protect it also, because it's a military capability you've created. China probably is not building so many bases because right now it's not confident of being able to protect those facilities the way a base is meant to be protected, a military base. But that's not something that it will not do in the future. Many of these bases ports where it has a lot of control interest could become a base at a later date. We don't know. Already they have a base now in Cambodia. Bangladesh, they built the BNS Sheikh Hasina. They could expand the capability of that. They may have built it for the Bangladesh Navy, but they are definitely going to use those facilities. It may not be a Chinese base, but basing facilities will be available to the Chinese Navy there. But I think over a period of years, in the next maybe 10 or 15 years, China will develop bases. China will have theater commands, which will control different parts of the ocean. Because if you really look at it very closely, you'll find China is modeling many of these things on the American model, particularly the theater command concept, etc. So I won't be surprised if China were to do that. They already think that, maritime power is going to be the key to their global power. And they will make every effort to consolidate that maritime power of theirs globally, en route to becoming a global superpower. So China's ports and bases, but exactly. So like I said, they have a base in Cambodia now. That's official. They have created BNS Sheikh Hasina, which is, well, not a Chinese base, but certainly China will have a lot of control over it because they've built it and, they have provided the ships which are going to be berthed there, the submarines which are going to be berthed there. Gwadar is going to be more or less a Chinese base. It may be Pakistani, it's a Pakistani deep sea port, but the China-Pakistan economic corridor begins from there. And China has invested a lot of money in the CPEC, which connects the Indian Ocean, which connects Chinese mainland to the Indian Ocean directly. Now, again, the CPEC may not turn out to be an economically viable project, but it's a sort of, it's an alternative for China should China have problems of its trade passing safely through the Malacca Straits, etc., or any other of the straits leading to the Western Pacific. It can use the CPEC for any emergency movement of stuff where the Malacca Strait can be circumvented. Similarly, in the Bay of Bengal, from the Kukfu port, they have taken a direct line to the Chinese mainland, a road connection. So they are doing all that. And if they're investing this kind of money, they're not going to allow anyone else to control these kind of facilities. So I think in the next 10 or 15 years, we will see Chinese bases coming up in various parts of the Indian Ocean. And where they won't have bases, they will have pretty, they will have enough port capability or port facilities to be able to turn around their ships if and when the need arises. So my estimate is that 10 years from now, the PLA Navy is going to be a very formidable presence in the Indian Ocean. Because you mustn't forget, if China has to have an edge in the Indian Ocean, it is not only the US Navy that has to worry about, it's the Indian Navy it has to worry about more. Because the Indian Navy is a very balanced, well-structured, blue water capable Navy. It may not have ship for ship or submarine for submarine the same sort of numbers as China has. But, naval strategy is not a zero-sum game of numbers. It's about what can we pit against an adversary, and is that sufficient? And I think in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Navy can more than hold its own against China for whatever China might want to pit against them in the Indian Ocean, at least over the next 10 or 15 years. And the Indian Navy is also not sitting idle by. We may not be able to have those kind of numbers, but our shipbuilding program, our submarine building program is moving steadily ahead. The Navy is deployed all over the Indo-Pacific. If you see the operational tempo of the Indian Navy, it's far, far more impressive than it ever was when we were in the Navy 15 or 18 or 20 years ago. I mean, now we are everywhere. We've got this multi-mission deployment. 12 to 15 Indian naval ships are deployed all across the Indo-Pacific to react to any emergency or any crisis that develops. And that is what has made us the preferred security partner. And as I mentioned, the first responder in the region. So this sort of credibility that the Indian Navy has gained over the years is going to stand it in very good stead when the time comes for it to exercise its own presence. But what the Indian Navy definitely cannot afford to do is lose the combat edge to China. And what China would be aiming to do would be to gain the combat edge on India in the Indian Ocean. So that's the sort of game that's going to be played out in the Indian Ocean in the next decade or so. And that's where Chinese ports and bases will be very useful to them.
And therefore, this brings me to the last question, which is that I understand that, in operation terms, theater to theater, conflict to conflict, we can more than match China. But what about actually building bases? Do we have the capabilities or even a strategy to, in a sense, counter the number of bases that China hopes to create with some of our own?
I think in the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure about how much effort we're putting into creating proper military bases, so to speak, because military bases need a lot of military infrastructure to support. But certainly we have very favorable terms and conditions with many ports, with many countries in the Indian Ocean region, where our ships go for an operational turnaround. They can be refueled. We've got Dukum, we've got Mauritius, we've heard about the runway that's been made in Agalega. We have ties with many countries. We have even a tie with Singapore. Plus, we've got these foundational agreements with our closer partners, Australia and the US, to be able to get logistic support from them from their bases. So while we may not establish bases of our own in the immediate future, because we need to have far greater resources for that, I'm sure we're looking at creating spheres of influence, if I may put it across in a more milder manner, where the Indian Navy would be able to get the support it requires to be able to perform the tasks it is required to do in the larger Indo-Pacific, without having to establish bases of its own. Of course, I'm sure as and when we reach that level of we have those kind of resources and we have that kind of power projection. We need that kind of power projection capability. A base would be probably a natural progression somewhere or the other, where it would, we could deploy our forces, forward deploy our forces also, if our interests are affected. Because at the end of the day, the Indian Navy's primary role is to defend India's maritime interests anywhere in the globe. And as India gets bigger, the economy gets bigger. If we're tomorrow a 10 trillion economy and then we're going to be a 30 trillion economy, our trade and energy is going to be coming from every part of the globe. We're going to engage a lot with the rest of the world, even far more than we've been doing so far. And if we have to protect these interests everywhere, then we obviously have to make sure that we have a presence, or at least facilities where, if and when we deploy, we are not handicapped by lack of resources or lack of any other capability. So I think all that, if you look at India's maritime interest itself, its own maritime interests, will drive the Navy's future capability enhancement over the next few years.
Thanks very much, Anil Jai Singh. Thanks very much. Such vast experience in the maritime domain, and of course your experience as a submariner for all those years. Thanks very much for talking to me about China's defense diplomacy and what's happening in the waters of the Bay of Bengal. Always a pleasure talking to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. As I said, it's always a pleasure. And I learn a lot from your questions, because I understand what exactly you're trying to sort of establish. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, indeed. Thank you.
Pleasure, sir. And no doubt, as this story develops in the months and years to come, we'll have many more opportunities to discuss this in detail with you. Thanks very much, sir, for your time.
I'll certainly look forward to that. Thank you very much. Thank you.